minute or two, I'd like to introduce Lynn, and then she will take over the meeting. And if any of you have any questions during Lynn's lecture, you're welcome to send a message via the chat. Aviva will just send a message now and say hello to everybody. You should notice on your screen a little red button comes up, and that's where your chat thing is. If anybody's got a question about that, we can help you once more to show you. Anyway, again, a warm welcome. Lynn Julius is the British-born daughter of Iraqi Jews, refugees. She graduated in international relations from the University of Sussex. Lynn is a journalist and blogger. Her works have appeared in The Guardian, the Jewish newspapers, Haaretz, Standpoint, and the Huffington Post, among many others. Lynn Julius is the founder of Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle Eastern and North African origin. Today, she shares with us Uprooted, 3,000 years of Jewish life that disappeared overnight. Then please share with us that wonderful topic, and we're glad to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Teddy, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be with you all. Thank you for having me. We should have been in Israel, but with the current coronavirus situation, we are still in London and pining for our 2 children who live in Israel and 2 grandchildren. So we were really desperate to come and join you in Israel.
Where do they live?
In London this morning.
Yes, I hope you will send. Can you send me some sunshine, because we're in desperate need of that here too. So
where do your children live?
So there's one in Tel Aviv and one in Rehovot. He's married.
Oh, wonderful.
With 2 children.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so thank you. The platform is now yours, and in this time, if anybody has questions, they will send them via the chat, and Aviva will manage them. And at the end of your thing, we will open for questions and answers.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much once again. So
thank you. Just one before you start. I just want to say that Lynn is also a volunteer, and it takes a lot of time and effort. And thank you so much for that, Lynn. It's honestly appreciated.
Thank you. Well, you're all volunteers. You're volunteers, and you're doing fantastic work with Telfed. So, you know, more power to your elbow.
Thank
you. Uprooted. Uprooted is actually the title of my book, which came out 2 years ago. It has since been translated into Norwegian, of all languages, and an Arabic translation is currently underway. And I do hope that there will soon be a Hebrew translation as well, and maybe even other languages. So I will tell you a little bit about how I came to write it and what I'm trying to say in this book. Well, as Teddy explained, I'm a journalist living in London, but I also run an organization called Harif, H-A-R-I-F. It is the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. You don't have to be from the Middle East and North Africa to join it. I welcome everybody to come and subscribe to our mailing list. It's free. And at the moment, we're running a series of online lectures, as you are, Zoom lectures, and we're getting, 100 people or more coming from all over the world, and it's all very exciting. Now, this organization I started 15 years ago now, because I felt there wasn't very much around about the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Their story is not well known, particularly in the Jewish diaspora outside Israel, which, as you know, is mostly Ashkenazi. And in England, where I live, the Sephardim and Mizrahim are actually quite a small minority, and their story is not known. So my organization does try and organize, well, we did try and organize, talks and film screenings, all with the objective of raising awareness of history and culture of these Jews. And alongside what I was doing for Harif, I started a blog called Point of No Return, which you can find on Google, Point of No Return blog. And this is updated every day with news and information about Jews from Arab countries and also Muslim countries. I've got about 6,000 posts or more on this blog, and it really is an archive of material for anyone interested in this subject. And this book, Uprooted, grew out of a Point of No Return blog, because after about 10 years, I thought, well, there are certain common themes that suggest themselves, and perhaps I should just write a book with the highlights from Point of No Return. And this is what I've done. And I have to tell you, writing a book is a lot harder than writing articles, which is what I usually do. So the other reason why I wrote this book is my own family background. I'm the daughter of refugees from Iraq, Jewish refugees who came to Britain in 1950. Now, they were in a small minority who did not go to Israel. Obviously, the Iraqi Jewish community is very big in Israel. I think it's the third biggest after the Soviet Jews and the Moroccan Jews. So the Iraqi Jews are quite an important component. Although I was born in Britain, the story of the Iraqi Jews haunted me as I was growing up, because we still had my grandparents and other relatives living in Baghdad in Iraq. And in the 60s, things began to deteriorate for them. The Six-Day War broke out. As you know, this was a great victory for Israel, but it was a complete catastrophe for the Arab countries. And the Iraqi regime began taking its revenge on the 3,000 or so Jews who were still left in Iraq out of an original community of about 150,000. So they began to freeze bank accounts, sack Jews from their jobs, cut off phones, and arrest Jews on the grounds that they were spies for Israel. And in January 1969, I don't know if any of you remember that fateful day when 9 Jews were hanged in Liberation Square in Baghdad. And they were obviously innocent. These were trumped up charges. It was a show trial. But 500,000 Iraqis came to sing and dance under the gallows. And this was absolutely terrifying for the remaining Jews. And the terror had just begun, really, for them, because Jews were being picked off the streets and jailed and would never be seen again. And we know about 50 Jews just disappeared, and we really don't know what happened to them. But this was a massive number compared to the overall size of the community, which was 2,000 to 3,000 people. So I had family still stuck in Iraq. They were desperate to get out. I had an aunt whose children were actually in London, and my parents were looking after them while my aunt was in Iraq. She thought she would just go for a few weeks to sell some property. In the end, she was trapped in Iraq for about 6 years. Eventually, my aunt got out, and my cousins, they were smuggled out through the north of Iraq, through Kurdistan, disguised as Arabs. They left in the dead of night with one suitcase as if they were going on holiday, and they made it across the border into Iran with the help of the Kurds. And of course, Israel was involved in the background with this smuggling operation. And about 2,000 Jews actually made it this way. They were smuggled illegally across the border into Iran, which then, it seems unbelievable now, was friendly to Israel. So the focus of my book is the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Now, this is a bigger number than Palestinians who left Israel, and it's the biggest number of non-Muslim refugees from Arab countries up until 2003, when there was a massive exodus of Christians from Iraq, and their numbers have gone down from 1.5 million to maybe 200,000. And this basically has been the pattern across the Middle East, that minorities, non-Muslim minorities have been forced out of these countries. And it's important to look at our plight, I think, in the context of the general plight of minorities. The whole issue of Jewish refugees is, I think, very important. In fact, I think it's the key to understanding the Middle East conflict, because the population of Israel, as you know, is more than 50% Mizrahi and Sephardi. These are people who themselves were refugees from Arab countries or are descendants of refugees from Arab countries. And they need to be part of any future peace settlement. Otherwise, it wouldn't be based on truth and justice. So this is the area we're talking about, from Morocco in the very west, right up until you can just about see, you can just about make out Yemen. You can see the capital Sana'a in the east. There you go. You can see the whole of Yemen there now. So that is the focus of my book, 10 Arab countries. I only touch on Iran in a superficial way because my main focus really is this massive exodus of Jews that occurred immediately after 1948. There was also an exodus from Iran, and in fact 90% of the Jews in Iran have left, but that didn't occur really up until about 1979, when the Ayatollahs took over. So looking at the history of the Jews in these countries, well, you can see how the Jewish population has declined. It's when you compare it to what happened in Europe during World War II, the population of the Middle East and North Africa has actually declined in a more dramatic way than that of Jews in Europe, even though obviously it didn't have the same tragic consequences. Most Jews got out alive from Arab states. But this was ethnic cleansing, there's no doubt about it. And from 850,000 Jews in 1948, we are now down to 4,000 in Arab countries. So just to have a look at these communities, this is a chart that shows you that these communities had hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of Jews in 1948. But today you can count them on the fingers of one or two hands. And some countries have no Jews at all. For instance, Algeria, for instance, Libya, and present-day Iraq has only 5 Jews left. The other thing you notice about this chart is how very old these Jewish communities were. They go back to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century before the Christian era. In fact, they go back to biblical times. For instance, the Jewish community of Iraq was 2,600 years old and goes back to the destruction of the first temple, when Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, took Jews from Jerusalem as slaves. He took them to Babylon, and by the rivers of Babylon, they sat down and wept. And some of them did go back to Jerusalem, but many of them stayed on and were in continuous residence in what is now Iraq for 2,600 years. Now, the Middle East really has almost as much Jewish history as the land of Israel itself. And there were 17 biblical figures that are buried in the region and 5 biblical prophets. And one of these was the prophet Ezekiel. And his shrine is about 2 hours drive south of Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. And on the left-hand side of your screen, you see a picture taken in the 30s. These were scribes that wrote down blessings and prayers for the Jews who came on pilgrimage to Ezekiel's tomb. And there were about 5,000 who came at the time of Shavuot, and they also come they usually used to come during the high holidays. Now, if you look at the picture on the right-hand side of your screen, this shows you a detail from the Hebrew inscriptions that surround the burial chamber of the tomb of Ezekiel. Now, as far as we know, those inscriptions are still there, but look at the general state of the shrine. It has been transformed beyond recognition. In fact, this huge Shiite mosque has been built around it, dwarfing the original shrine of Ezekiel. And Shia Muslim pilgrims come to this shrine. If a Jew turned up and said he wanted to go and visit the shrine of Ezekiel, he probably wouldn't be allowed in, because this is a holy Muslim shrine. And this, in a way, is what's happened to Jewish heritage in the Middle East. It has either been appropriated as Muslim heritage, or it has been allowed to decay, to crumble to dust. Cemeteries have been vandalized, roads have been built on them, synagogues have been turned into gyms or other uses, and really there is very little left of Jewish heritage. You know, very little to say that Jews actually lived in Arab countries for 2,000 years, even before Islam. That's 1,000 years before Islam. There is one exception to this, and that is in Morocco, where the king has actually invested a lot of money in preserving and restoring Jewish sites, cemeteries, and even Jewish quarters. But we know that Morocco has an underlying motive for this. Tourism is the second most important currency earner in Morocco, and a lot of Jewish tourists visit Morocco and are interested in seeing Jewish sites. And unfortunately, the Jewish population of Morocco is only 1% of what it used to be. So these synagogues, restored synagogues, are soon going to be no more than empty buildings. So let's look at what the relationship was like between Jews and Muslims during the 14 centuries that they lived in the same space. There is this myth that Jews and Muslims sort of coexisted in relative harmony. But when you say coexistence, that implies a sort of equality of relationship between Jews and Muslims. But that wasn't the case at all, because the Jews actually had an inferior status known as dhimmi. And under Sharia law, the dhimmi does not have the same rights as a Muslim. Christians were also dhimmi, Jews and Christians. They were allowed to practice their religion, but they were always having to be reminded that they were inferior to Muslims because they hadn't accepted the final revelation. And so they had to abide by certain restrictions. They had to wear special clothing. They couldn't build synagogues higher than mosques. They couldn't ride a horse because that was a noble animal. Their testimony was worth half that of a Muslim in a court of law. And above all, they had to pay a tax to the ruler for their own protection. And the ruler would have to defend them. Now, these Jews were not allowed to carry arms or defend themselves in any way. They subcontracted their right to self-defense to the ruler of the day. And you may ask yourself, well, why did they need to be protected? And the truth was, although pogroms did not break out as often in the Muslim world as, say, in the Christian world, the Jewish situation, the Jewish condition was really quite insecure, and they were subject to kind of frequent raids on Jewish quarters, where the mob would go and loot. People could walk into Jewish homes without any prior notice and just take what they want. Really, the Jews had very few rights. And I will just read you a short passage from my book to illustrate this. In a similar way to their Ashkenazi counterparts in medieval Europe, Jews in Morocco were debarred from certain occupations by the Islamic guilds. As in Europe, they performed certain necessary economic functions like money lending and associated tasks like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. The Jews were given the most menial of tasks. One such job assigned to them was the salting of the decapitated heads of executed captives. In Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewers was done by a subcaste of Jews. In Egypt today, the Christian Copts are the rubbish collectors. In 20th century Iraq, Christians also did menial jobs in conformity with their lowly status, like cleaning septic tanks. The small Sephardi community of Palestine was so abased under Muslim rule that a contingent of Ashkenazi followers of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi, seeking refuge in Jerusalem in 1700, refused to put up with the humiliations suffered by the Sephardim. The Arabs behave as proper thugs towards the Jews, one wrote. In Palestine, Jews were not allowed to worship freely at their holy places. The Mamluk rulers forbade them from treading beyond the seventh step on the staircase to the burial place of the patriarchs in Hebron. Nothing equals the misery and suffering of the Jews of Jerusalem, wrote Karl Marx. Turks, Arabs, and Moors are the masters in every respect. To be a dhimmi was to be continually reminded of Islam's supremacy over Judaism and Christianity. Of course, Jews performed an essential function as commercial go-betweens and could and did rise to lofty positions as courtiers, sarafs, that's treasurers, and merchants. Some were fabulously rich, like Haim Farhi, but like him, these Jews could just as quickly fall into disfavor. Farhi had his nose cut off and his eye gouged out by a treacherous Ottoman governor and was subsequently assassinated. So the dhimmi status, I have to say, was a status of complete precariousness. You know, sometimes things could be very good and the Jews could prosper, and other times things could be terrible. But the Jews could never really be sure, you know, what the future would bring. Now, all this came to an end in the 19th century with the start of the European colonial era. And the Western colonial powers began to make inroads into the Middle East and North Africa and to insist that the Jews and the Christians be given equal rights with the Muslims. And so in 1856, the dhimmi status was actually abrogated in the Ottoman Empire. But not all the Arab countries came under Ottoman rule, and the dhimmi status persisted in countries like Persia up until 1925, and in Morocco until 1912, with the start of the French protectorate. But in the Ottoman Empire, the restrictions were lifted, and this was the beginning of a sort of golden age for the Jews. About the same time as the abrogation of the dhimmi status, a group of French Jews, well-meaning French Jews, decided to set up a network of schools in the Muslim world. That network was called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And what these French Jews wanted to do was to really prepare the Jews of these communities for the modern world, because up until then, they'd only received a sort of religious education in the Talmud Torah. And then only boys would be educated. They'd be educated to read Hebrew, obviously. But what the Alliance Israélite Universelle did was it made education available to all, including girls, for the first time. And these Jews would be given a Western education. They were taught languages, English, French, Turkish, even Hebrew, and Arabic. They were taught maths, they were taught science. So what happened was a middle class began to emerge, and they were well placed to become the backbone of the colonial administrations when the British and the French set up their protectorates and their mandates in the early 20th century. So before long, the Jews became dominant in the civil service, in trade, in commerce, in banking. Jewish entrepreneurs built railways in Egypt. They set up companies. They brought modern Western inventions into the Arab world. There were two Jewish finance ministers who were appointed in the early 20th century. One was Sir Sasson Heskel in Iraq, and the other one was Katawi Pasha in Egypt. And when you speak to Jews, many of them have nostalgic memories of this era. And they remember, you know, having big houses and servants, and the food tasted better, and this sort of thing. But actually, this was a very brief era, which really ended in the 1940s. During this cultural golden age, Jews were very prominent in the arts. And here you see some examples of musicians and actors and actresses, directors who really were leaders in their field, and are still, their music and their achievements still known in the Arab world today, but it's not often known that these were Jews. So the woman you see on the bottom left is actually on the front cover of my book. Her name is Camelia, that was her stage name, and her real name is Lillian Levy Cohen. And this actress, she was very young when she was first discovered. She made about 18 films in the space of 3 years. But then tragically, she was killed in a plane crash at the age of only 21. But there was a conspiracy theory that King Farouk had her as his mistress, and he engineered the plane crash because it wasn't convenient for her to be around. But that's probably just a conspiracy theory. Jews were also prominent in music. In fact, most of the musicians in Iraq were Jews because the Muslims were not allowed to learn to play music. And so the Jews stepped into the breach. And there is a story that the Iraqi prime minister switched on his radio in the 1940s, and it was Yom Kippur. And there was silence. He heard silence. And he asked his aides, well, why isn't there no music? Why is there no music? And he was told, well, you know, it's Yom Kippur. The Jews don't play music on Yom Kippur. And so he got so annoyed, he resolved to set up a Muslim orchestra. The woman on the bottom right is a famous Jewish singer called Salima Murad, who actually did not leave Iraq with the mass migration in 1950. She stayed on. And there were others. Layla Murad, who actually was one of the most famous singers and actresses in Egypt, she stayed on in Egypt. She converted to Islam. But her music is played to this day. But a lot of Arabs do not know that she is Jewish. But this golden age did come to an end. It was ended by anti-Semitism, and there were two types of anti-Semitism. One was colonial anti-Semitism. Here you see a pamphlet produced by Edouard Drumont, who was the MP for Algeria. Now, Algeria is an interesting case because it was actually part of metropolitan France after 1830. And the Jews were granted French citizenship. The Muslims did not have French citizenship. But there was quite a big population of white settlers in Algeria called the Pieds Noirs, and they resented the Jews because they didn't think that the Jews deserved to have French citizenship. And in fact, there were riots that were started by the white settlers in Algeria. And there was a great deal of anti-Semitism amongst these white settlers. Now, the colonial powers, while they were very happy to exploit the Jews for their talents and their languages and their administrative skills, there was a limit to how far they would protect them in times of trouble. And we have several examples during the 20th century of riots breaking out, and the forces of law and order, the French police, for instance, are taking hours to come and quell the riot. And another famous example would be what happened in 1941 in Iraq, where when there was a massacre of Jews called the Farhud in June 1941. The rioting took place over 2 days. We don't know exactly how many Jews were murdered. The official estimates are 179, but there could have been up to 600 Jews killed at that time. Now, the British could have easily stopped this massacre. In fact, the British Army were at the gates of Baghdad, but they refused to intervene because they didn't want to be seen to be occupying Iraq. So this sort of thing happened. The colonial powers also, as you know, during World War II, there were pro-Nazi governments established in North Africa, the Vichy government in Morocco, in Algeria, in Tunisia. And these regimes actually started implementing the first stages of the final solution in these countries, stripping Jews of their rights. So in a way, the colonial powers, for all the good they did to their Jewish minorities, were prepared to betray them at the end of the day. And had the Allies not defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, then the Jews would have been subject to the same fate as the Jews in Europe. Okay. Another form of anti-Semitism arose at this time, and this was the anti-Semitism associated with Arab nationalism. Now, Arab nationalism arose in the 20th century. Various Arab parties emerged, and what they wanted was independence from the colonial powers. And an extreme form of Arab nationalism arose at this time, and this was quite heavily influenced by Nazism. So you got blood and soil nationalist parties, for instance, the Ba'ath Party, for instance, this party here, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, whose emblem you see on your screen, which might remind you of another emblem. And these parties still exist today. As you know, President Assad is the president of the Ba'ath Party in Syria. Now, these nationalist parties really were blood and soil parties that wanted to exclude and actually marginalize anyone who was not Arab and not Muslim. And minorities found themselves sort of ushered towards the exit. There were also paramilitary youth groups based on the Nazi model, and they held torchlight processions like those at Nuremberg. And there were sort of fierce nationalists, for instance, in Iraq, who took control of the main of the Directorate of Education and started brainwashing the school children with anti-Semitism. There was another type of anti-Semitism that arose in the Arab world at this time, and that was the anti-Semitism of Islamism. Now, we hear a lot about Islamism nowadays. We hear about Islamic State or Daesh or ISIL, ISIS, whatever you want to call it. We hear about al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and Hamas. But basically all these movements really have their roots in the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1928. And it was also inspired by Nazism. You see on the left-hand side, the gentleman in the fez, Hassan al-Banna. He was an Egyptian who founded the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. And what he wanted to do was re-establish the caliphate that had come to an end with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. He wanted to turn the clock back. And for the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jews were the epitome of evil. Anti-Semitism was at the core of their philosophy because they were against everything that the Jews stood for. The Jews stood for change and modernity and women's rights and civil rights, minority rights. And this was anathema to them. And throughout the 1930s, they adopted violence as a means to an end. And by the mid-1940s, there were 1 million men under arms in Egypt. And what the Muslim Brotherhood did was start inciting riots against the Jews and the Copts as early as the 1930s. And of course, they became very militant about what was going on in Palestine. And they began to ally with the Palestinian leadership. Hajj Amin al-Husseini was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. And al-Husseini worked very closely with Hassan al-Banna. What Hajj Amin al-Husseini did was he invented a new kind of ideology that fused Nazi anti-Semitism with the kind of anti-Jewish verses you get in the Quran. And this was a new ideology altogether because the traditional Muslim view of the Jew was that he wasn't very important. He wasn't a threat. He'd been defeated by the armies of Muhammad in the 7th century. And so he could be tolerated, but he really wasn't very powerful. And what the Muslim Brotherhood and Hajj Amin al-Husseini did was they kind of introduced this idea of this European idea, really, of the Jew as powerful. And these ideas of the protocols of the Elders of Zion and of Nazism, that the Jew was powerful, that there was a conspiracy to dominate the world, these ideas began to penetrate the Arab world at this time, and they're still there today. Now, the Germans, and here you see the German ambassador to Iraq during most of the 1930s, Fritz Grobber, the Germans financed the activities of both the Mufti and of the Muslim Brotherhood. What they wanted to do was encourage the Arabs to rise up against the British and the French. In 1939, the Mufti of Jerusalem was sent into exile by the British to Baghdad. He spent 2 years in Baghdad fermenting hatred against the local Jews and trying to overthrow the pro-British government. And in April, May 1941, he finally succeeded, together with a group of pro-Nazi Iraqi politicians and officers, they succeeded in overthrowing the pro-British government, and they declared a military alliance with Germany and Italy, and they declared war against Britain. And during that time, they did not cease to incite against the Jews of Iraq. And the result of that was the Farhud, which I mentioned earlier, which was this massacre of June 1941. Thankfully, the British won the war against the pro-Nazi government in Iraq. They put the leaders of this government to flight. The Mufti did flee Iraq and ended up in Berlin and spent the rest of the war as a guest of Hitler. The picture you see at the bottom of your screen is an Arabic version of Mein Kampf. Now, this was translated into Arabic and serialized in Iraqi papers in the 1930s. Now, this is the Mufti at his famous meeting with Hitler in November 1941. And the purpose of this meeting was to ask Hitler's permission for the Mufti to manage the extermination of the Jews, not just in Palestine, and we know he had plans for concentration camps in the Dotan Valley, not just in Palestine, but across the Arab world. Because of course he was convinced that the Nazis would emerge victorious from World War II, and he'd be able to have a free hand to exterminate the Jews. So it's often said that his alliance with Hitler was a pragmatic alliance against the British and the French, but he wouldn't have stopped short, had the Nazis emerged victorious, he wouldn't stop short of exterminating the Jews. I think he would have gone along to the bitter end. While he was in Berlin, the Mufti set up Muslim SS divisions in Yugoslavia, and here you can see the Muslim soldiers at prayer. There is a myth that the Holocaust did not affect Jews in Arab countries. But in fact, Tunisia came under direct Nazi control for 6 months between November 1942 and May 1943. And the top picture shows Jewish men being marched off to labor camps in Tunisia. The bottom picture shows Libyan Jews who also suffered during the war. There was a particularly nasty concentration camp in Libya called Jado, and 600 Jews died there of typhus or starvation. And about 800 Jews of British nationality were deported to Bergen-Belsen. Here you see survivors returning in a railway carriage to Tripoli in 1945, and you can just make out the Union Jack scrawled in chalk on the railway carriage because they were of British nationality. Maybe not. And also not very well known, the existence of labor camps in Morocco. About 2,000 of the inmates were Jews, mainly European Jews. And they were building the Trans-Sahara Railway during the war. And these are pictures of what's left of these camps. So the big question is, what came first, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism? There is a myth that there was no anti-Semitism in the Arab world up until the establishment of Israel in 1948. But this picture is of the aftermath of the pogrom in Fez in 1912, in which 45 Jews died. So obviously pogroms did happen in the Arab world. Jews did die in riots. And of course there was the dhimmi status, which we talked about. So it is a myth to say that anti-Semitism in the Arab world began in 1948. And if you look at the treatment of other minorities who have no Israel of their own, for instance, the Yazidis, the Copts, the Assyrians, and other religious minorities, they too have suffered enormously from persecution. But only the Jews have been fortunate to have somewhere to go to, a haven to take them in. So fast forward to 1948, Israel is declared. 7 Arab states declare war against Israel. They declare a second war against their own Jewish citizens. And in fact, we know that they had premeditated a series of state-sanctioned laws, measures to take against their Jews, stripping them of their rights, freezing their bank accounts, that sort of thing, dispossessing them of their property. And above all, they made Zionism a crime. In other words, you could be arrested, you could be jailed, you could be prosecuted, and you could even be executed for being a Zionist. But how do you define Zionism? Was being in possession of a letter from Palestine, was that Zionism? Was wearing a watch being a Zionist? Because Jews were rumored to be sending secret signals with their watches to the Zionists, and they could be arrested, and Jews were arrested and tried. So for doing this. So there was a great deal of tension. Jews were not allowed to leave these countries initially in 1948. There were violent episodes. For instance, more than 80 Jews were murdered in Yemen, in Aden. As some of you would have heard from Sarah at the Aden Jewish Heritage Museum, more than 80 Jews died then. There were riots in Syria, there were riots in Egypt, hundreds of Jews died there. And in 1945 and 1948 in Libya, there were also hundreds of Jews who died in riots in Tripoli. And so all this created a great deal of misery. Jews were desperate to leave. Eventually, the governments of Arab countries relented. They reached deals with Israel, and Israel organized rescue missions for Jews in Yemen, Jews in Libya, Jews in Iraq. And these were airlifts. And tens of thousands of Jews left their countries in this way. But there was a price to pay. For instance, this document here is a laissez-passer issued to an Iraqi Jew who came to Israel. And on the left-hand side, you see a stamp in Arabic which says, "One way, no return." And effectively, this Jew was being allowed out of the country, but he was not going to be allowed back in. So I'd call this expulsion. And the same thing happened in 1956 in a most dramatic fashion to Egyptian Jews, many of whom were forced to leave the country within 24 hours after the Suez crisis. So they were stripped of their nationality, and they were also dispossessed of their property and assets. And this is the home of the Zuckerman family in Egypt, and it is now the Swiss embassy in Cairo. And it's astonishing that there was a wealthy class of Jews in Egypt. And if you look at the, this is Tahrir Square, which is in the center of Cairo. And there was an article in the Hebrew press, which actually listed all the Jewish-owned properties in the vicinity of Tahrir Square. And if you look at embassies, so many of them used to be Jewish-owned. For instance, the Pakistani embassy, the South Korean embassy, the German embassy, the Canadian embassy, the Dutch embassy. So a massive amount of property was seized from Jews, and of course they never got compensation. They were sent out of the country with one suitcase and £20 in their pockets. So what happened to these Jews? Well, the vast majority, that's 650,000 out of 850,000, went to Israel. Now, Israel was then a very poor developing country and only had 600,000 people living in it. So basically, the arrival of these refugees doubled the Israeli population virtually overnight. And Israel was fighting a war. It didn't have enough food. It didn't have jobs for these people. And it certainly didn't have the accommodation. So it had to house them in tent camps. And these ma'abarot lasted, some of them, for 10 or more years. There weren't always tents, but there were tin huts or wooden huts, and they slowly developed into proper towns. And Israel is dotted with these towns that began life as ma'abarot, for instance, Sderot, for instance, Rosh Ha'ayin, and many, many others, or Yehuda. And it was very, very difficult at the beginning for these refugees. But ultimately, they survived, they integrated into Israeli society, and now they are represented at every level, in every field. With the exception of perhaps, there's never been a prime minister who's Mizrahi, but there are Mizrahi ministers in the present government. In fact, I think a third of them have Moroccan roots. This is an invitation to a wedding in one of the Ma'abarot. The invitation says, please come to our wedding. There's a picture of the bride and groom. Please come to our wedding in tent number 10 or something. So as I say, the integration was very tough, but it was ultimately successful. The question is, why don't we know this story? And it's true that for decades, the Israeli government said very little about this story. No issue was made of it, and the narrative was neglected in schools. This artwork by an artist called Meir Gal shows you how few pages in a school textbook were dedicated to the history and heritage of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. All this has begun to change in the last few years. There is now a day in the calendar. It's the 30th of November to commemorate the exodus of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And my organization, Harif, certainly marks that day. And I would urge you to do the same. In fact, I think every community, every organization around the world should be marking that day in the same way as we mark Holocaust Memorial Day and other important days in the Jewish calendar, because this is our history. It's not just the history of part of the Jewish people, you know, in the same way as the Holocaust is a Jewish story, this is a Jewish story, and it needs to be taught and known about. I would just leave you with a final thought, and that is that the Jews are an indigenous people in the Middle East. They had a continuous presence in Palestine, but also elsewhere in the region. And the region itself is known as the Arab world, but this is a really misleading concept, because the region is a patchwork of different groups, different ethnicities, different religions, some of whom have been there well before Islam, and the Jews are one of them, and they have every right to self-determination. It's wrong to think that only Arabs have political rights in the Middle East. And some of these indigenous peoples, for instance, the Kurds, have been clamoring for self-determination for over 100 years, and they have not achieved this. But I think the lesson that we've learned is that to survive in this inhospitable region, you do need your own state and the power to defend it. So I think we're all very grateful that Israel exists to defend the Jewish people. And on that note, I will thank you for listening. Thank you very much indeed. And I'm very happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you so much, Len. I hope that you can all hear me. There are some questions on the Zoom. Aviva, if you'll please read them out. And some of them you have touched on, but please read them out for all.
Right. So Stanley asks, he's interested to know how the Jews from these Middle Eastern communities integrated with the Ashkenazi Jews already in Palestine and in Israel today. Oh, that's a big question. Well, of course, the opposite happened when the Ashkenazi immigrants first began arriving in the late 19th century, early 20th century. They found a majority Sephardi community in Palestine. And these Jews had been around since at least the 15th century, after the Spanish Inquisition. And of course, there were Yemenite Jews who came even before the first Aliyah in 1991. But they were soon outnumbered by the Ashkenazi communities. The Ashkenazi communities set about establishing all the institutions of the Yishuv. And they did so, you know, in their own image, if you like. In other words, they set up trade unions and things and institutions really that were Western institutions and the beginnings of democracy and universities and all this sort of thing. So when the mass exodus happened in the 1950s from Arab countries, these communities had to slot into institutions that were already there, and they found it quite hard. And there was a bit of a culture shock. You know, and of course there was tension. You know, it didn't always go smoothly. But I'd say that today Israel is quite a well-integrated society. There are a lot of mixed marriages. By that I mean between Ashkenazim and Sephardim or Mizrahim. Apparently a quarter of all marriages are across the divide. So more and more Israelis are, you know, have like one Mizrahi and one Ashkenazi parent. And I think this has really changed the character of Israel today, and probably accounts for the fact that, you know, Middle Eastern food and music and everything is so popular today. So, you know, it's, I hope that answers your question. Yeah. So
Because there are lots of questions and lots of compliments you received. There's another question. I don't know if the person's still here. He said he had to leave, but
yeah.
you might.
Okay. I will just deal with how can we buy the book.
Yes.
You can buy the book. It's on Amazon. It's also at Pomerantz in Jerusalem for those who can get there. And Sipur Pashut had a few copies in Tel Aviv.
And I think our son has about 6 copies left in Tel Aviv as well himself. Yeah.
So I can put you in touch with our son in Tel Aviv. I think he's got about 6 copies. So we can organize that with you, Teddy.
And coronavirus permitting, I think we're planning to come out on the 1st of October for 3 weeks. But the way the numbers are going in Israel, it's looking less and less likely. And we have about 30 copies packed in our suitcase.
Yes, that's right. We keep putting off our trip. It's terrible.
Well, we hope that you will be able to come soon, and we welcome you with open arms.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your morning with us and the lovely information, fascinating information. I'm sure that our CEO, Doron Klein, would like to say good morning for a minute. And thank you for joining us, everybody.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It was fascinating.
Oh, so
Yes,
it was a real
was.
pleasure. Thank you. Thank
If
you.
anybody would like to ask a personal question, now's the time. You can all unmute yourselves and ask a question.
I know Doron would like to say a few words.
Okay. Just give us a second, Doron. Let's see if anybody else would like to ask.
There's a question here.
Thank you for a most informative talk.
Oh, thank you.
You're all welcome. Really welcome. And I do hope people will take your book and read it and enjoy it.
Thank you.
Just so that you should know, part of my business is I'm a freight forwarder. And not connected to the Telfed, of course.
I think we
a big amount of our business is books, educational books.
Excellent. Well, that could be very useful.
How could we arrange to take a box of books to Israel? How much would that cost us?
However many times you want, I can ship.
That sounds great. It's a deal.
We'll talk offline, yeah.
No problem. Anyway, once again, thank you everybody for joining us. I think Doron Klein would like to say a few words. Is that right?
So thank you very much, Lynn. That was a wonderful, very informative talk. We all learned so much from that, and we appreciate your time. You can see how much